Hello, you're watching Topher Parker Cars. Now once again, I'm not Topher, but if you've been a follower on this channel for a while, you'll probably know that I bought this car off of Facebook Marketplace, which was a 1987 Chrysler Fifth Avenue. At the time, one of the cars I was always at the top of my bucket list when it came to cars I wanted to buy and tinker with was a 1980s Chrysler M-Body car, especially a Chrysler Fifth Avenue, just like this one. I messaged the guy, made an offer. We both drove down to Provo to purchase this car, drove it back, and if you ever got to watch that video, it didn't quite go as planned. What happened there, as I'll get into detail with, was when I stalled at that gas station. It turned out that the car was just running very lean. It just wasn't getting enough fuel, or it just wasn't burning right. When we finally got the car back to here, I looked under the hood and found out just the ignition distributor was not quite in tune with the engine the way it was supposed to be. So I got it retimed and now it runs perfectly, which, knock on this very fine plastic wood, still holding up strong even after a few months of ownership. So with that, let's get into the details of the car, see what you think. Like I've said before, if you got to watch the previous video on this car, you'll see that we made an agreed offered price of $2,400. As far as how much work I've had to put in this car, it really wasn't as much as I thought it would. And for the agreed price of $2,400, I think this car came out really clean, which I shall show you throughout this review. Now, before I get into an in-depth review of this car, I think it'd be cool to talk about a brief history of this car and what it represented in Chrysler's lineup. While this particular Chrysler came out in 1987, the bare chassis that this Chrysler sits on actually came out in 1977, but it wasn't badged by Chrysler. It was actually used by Plymouths and Dodges for their police cars throughout the late 70s and early 80s. And it wasn't until 1982 that Chrysler used this body and put their Chrysler logo and model badging on it. But the Chrysler M-Body replaced what was called the Chrysler R-Body, which ran throughout the 70s. And compared to the Chrysler R-Body, this was much more up-to-date than the R-Body, which I don't even know how many years that ran, but basically, by the time the late 70s came around, the R-Body was kind of being outdated. People are starting to lose interest in the large, big body Chrysler, especially because that was right around when America was still recovering from the oil crisis, which was choking down these big, thirsty V8 cars. And unless Chrysler could come out with a new downsized car, Chrysler was on the verge of running out of money and just going out of the business completely. And Chrysler's final result was this, the Chrysler M-Body. Like I said, it came out from 1977 and ran all the way to 1989. The particular cars that used this M-Body were the Dodge Diplomat, Plymouth Grand Fury, and the more luxurious model, the Chrysler Fifth Avenue. Now, despite the larger sticker price of the Chrysler Fifth Avenue, this was actually their best-selling model on the M-Body. And while the Chrysler M-Body was still a relatively outdated, cost-cutting design, it still, at least in my opinion, represented what 80s motoring was all about. Every time I watch a movie in the 1980s, I will see at least one of these, whether it was badged as a Dodge Diplomat, Chrysler Fifth Avenue, or especially a Plymouth Grand Fury being used as police cars or just as seen in the background as public transportation. And anytime I spot any of these cars in movies from that era, it always makes me think about just how popular these cars once were. And now every time I drive around this thing, I almost never see them. And once in a while when I do see them, the vinyl top's gone, the paint's all rusted away. And it also just makes me think of just how much harder it is to find a nice example like this one, at least in my opinion. And with that, let's get into the review. Now, the first thing that you guys are going to notice about this car, looking at it especially from a distance, is this horrendously ugly Landau top. Now, considering how fragile these tops are when exposed to heat and weather elements, this top is actually in pretty good shape on this car. And also, as you can see right here, it proudly says Fifth Avenue Edition. Now, despite that emblem saying it's a Fifth Avenue Edition, the car itself is called a Fifth Avenue, so technically, if you want to go off of the specific trim, you could say it's a Chrysler Fifth Avenue Edition. I find that kind of funny. But there's actually a little bit of history onto why it has that badge as well. Back when the Chrysler K cars were coming out, this car was actually called the New Yorker. And if you wanted a higher trim level, you got a Fifth Avenue Edition. But in 1984, for whatever Chrysler was doing for some reason, they decided to bring out the New Yorker on a whole other chassis that was V6 front-wheel drive. There was a very confusing time when this car, called the New Yorker at the time, and the new replacement New Yorker was running in the same market, which must have made it very confusing for buyers. But shortly after, they decided to rebadge the Chrysler New Yorker M-Body as the Fifth Avenue, which left the New Yorker in the other chassis. But now, again, going away from the history of the car, going on to the vinyl roof itself, this particular top's in really good shape considering the age of the car. Although there are some little places that's starting to show wear. I still, like I said, most people that come see this would be pretty impressed that this is holding up very well. Another kind of cool thing that I've noticed about this Landau top, if you could call a Landau top cool, is that this car will have had these really cool opera lights, which unfortunately don't work on this car. But the idea is these light bars will light up whenever you turn the lights on, giving it a very nice, very luxurious looking side marker. But for now, that's not quite on the top of my mind compared to other stuff that this car needs. Now, another thing I want to talk about on this car are the wheels. Now, sitting behind this very high quality hubcap is 15-inch wheels. Now, by today's standards, 15-inch wheels are absolutely puny tiny. But back when this car came out, 15-inch wheels was kind of considered a nice option for a luxury car. Even though that today, some cars you can get 22-inch wheels depending on the car you're looking at. But even though, again, these are tiny 15-inch wheels, for this kind of car, it actually doesn't look too small in this car, which is pretty interesting. While some of you think this chrome wired hubcap is absolutely horrendous, you are absolutely right. I do think these are pretty ugly hubcaps, but it's part of the car, and this car still has all four of them. So I'm grateful for that for sure. Now moving on to the front end of the car. Now if you look past all this chrome that this car has, my favorite part of the front of this car is this iconic 80s Chrysler Pentastar emblem, which is supposed to look like a crystal, even though I don't think it's anything more than plastic, but it still looks great from inside the car. I find it cool that the car still has it, even though it's cracked, but hey, it's an old car, what can you expect? Looking through other parts of the car, you have a big metal grille in the front, big chrome bumpers with over bump stops. Happened to accidentally rear end someone with this car. I can only imagine with new cars, plastic molded bumpers, that this big metal chrome bumper would absolutely shatter the plastic bumper. While this car's only evidence of being in a front collision would just be the very minor red scrape of the paint from the other bumper. It definitely shows how much more raw metal was used in this car when building this thing, which definitely, when you work around this car or drive it, definitely gives you a sense of durability and high build quality that it actually lacks. But again, as we start moving towards the back of the car, you'll notice that despite having a Chrysler Pentastar hood emblem, there's nowhere on the front, very front of this car that actually says it's a Chrysler. That's because where it actually says Chrysler is on the driver's side rearview mirror. But then moving to the passenger side of the car, there's a little chrome dome sticking out of that passenger side fender. That's actually the power antenna, which miraculously on this car still works. And when it does roll out, it's just a massive 3-4 foot long metal beam that goes up into the air, sticking out like a massive satellite, ready to attract any radio data that may be coming through the air. That's what I love about this car. It's just that there's no like styling proportions on this car at all, especially coming to stuff like that. Moving on to the inside of the car. Before I point out any details on this car, first thing we're gonna test is legroom. Now, just to point out, first off, I'm 6'1", and this seat is in my position, which in other words is all the way back. So getting in, oh, very comfy seats, and for a car of this size, it's actually more room than you think back here. I have not much, but enough headroom to be comfortable. There's enough leg room, considering that this seat is all the way back. I still have enough knee space to comfortably move around. Close the door. And looking throughout the door, you have this very nice, very fine velour on this door, followed by lots of very fine wood carved from the finest plastic trees. You have your power window switch and a ashtray, which in this car, you know, a little rusty, but it's there. And then following the bottom of the door, you have your dome light and very fine, very, very soft carpeting along the door. But again, looking around the car, as I try to buckle myself into this seat, you notice that there's no shoulder belt and no headrest in sight. The only thing that's keeping you secure in this car is a lap belt. And while the driver and front passenger get a shoulder belt as well and headrests, Back passengers only get a lap belt because clearly the front passengers are better than you. You have a large leather grab handle back here in case your front driver decides to do a joyride in this car, which if you know how these cars drive, which we'll get to in a little bit, hopefully they don't do that. Otherwise you're going to find these very, very useful. And again, going back to luxury amenities and design of this car, there's not really that much features back here. Like I said, just a power window and you get an ashtray in here. But when you're sitting back here, you don't think about that because all you can think about is wanting to go sleep in these very fine, very cushiony, tufted Kimberly velvet seats. Because that's what these seats were called. But if you got the leather interior, which I do wish I got, this would have been called Corinthian leather, which, if any of you wondering what Corinthian leather means, it means absolutely nothing. It was just for marketing, but it was just really nice leather. Anyway, this car does not have that. It has what's called Kimberly velvet, which, while it's not leather, it's still very comfortable. Lots of cushion, so much so that I honestly would not want to change anything about this seat. It's just so nice that they just threw tons of stuff into these seats, gave it some stylish tufting, and just called it good. Honestly, I can't complain. It's super nice back here. And now moving towards the front of the car, sitting once again on these very cushiony tufted seats, pulling on another wood hinge. We're now in the driver's seat. Now throughout this car's production, there have been a couple interior changes made to this car, but for this car, it's still very much early 80s design, despite being a late 80s model. Starting with, depending on your point of view on this car, you either find the steering wheel very iconic or very, very ugly. To me, I'm kind of in between. I can already see at least 2 to 3 different shades of tan, followed by the Chrysler crystal emblem on the center of the steering wheel. But on very early ones, they had a different version of a 2-spoke wheel, while the later ones later got a 4-spoke steering wheel and an airbag. You have a similar design as the back door, lots of fine rubber around, fake wood absolutely everywhere on this car. Lots of velvet, another wood hinge, and what would have been down here was a door handle, but because this has the rare Bluetooth handle, I get to carry the door handle in my hand. But on the downside of that, the only way to turn it on is you have to open the door from the outside. So it's going to need a little work there to get that fixed, but hey, it'd be a nice rare option though. Again, going to the bottom of the door, lots of very fine soft carpeting. That's on all the doors. Now moving up the door, you'll find a very unusual ergonomic design of the door window switches, which instead of the window switches being next to each other, like front driver, front passenger, then rear driver, rear passenger, instead they just made it one big row of switches. They're not next to each other, they're just in one singular line, and that goes with the door locks and the window locks as well. Moving up to the very front of the door, you'll find this cable-operated mirror switch, which adjusts this absolutely tiny side mirror. I don't know why they had to add the complexity of a cable here when the mirror is closer to you than the actual switch, but oh well, that's just the time, I guess. Kind of like the car as a whole, this whole interior is not really, the most well put together when you start looking really closely. Like there's lots of little things that are just really loose, not very well put together. But hey, there still should have been some quality input put into this car, considering that everything still works in this car despite being a 1987. This interior is in really good shape. You have this metal or plastic dash. I have a hard time identifying it, but I'm gonna go on a limb and say this is actually a metal dash up in the front, followed by, in front of that, a very fine rubber stitching up in the front, which is in really good shape. Moving down, you have your radio controls and your very small climate controls, which are very simple, easy to use. So you have 3 different buttons for your various air conditioning adjustments, which all work. Yes, the air conditioning does work in this car. You have a heater and a button for defroster, and 4 speeds for the fan, and 1 massive sliding switch for your temperature. That's it. There's nothing more to the climate control than that. Moving towards the left side of the dash, you have your very straightforward gauge cluster. No tachometer in this car, which is very normal for an 80s car, but instead of a tachometer, you have a massive fuel gauge. You have a speedometer, coolant temperature, and a volt gauge. Moving for the left of that, at the bottom left, you have a massive panel, which is left just for the headlights, which me and Topher find absolutely hilarious that they just use up this massive space just for a tiny little headlight knob. A little bit to the right of that, you have your window defroster, which still works on this car. Now moving up from the defroster switch, we actually have these very tiny air vents, which despite how tiny they are, they actually can move air pretty well. Moving towards the steering column, you have your very common column shifter, which unfortunately is missing the knob right here. I do hope to find one at some point, but again, that's not really on my mind of something I want to fix at the moment. Looking around the column, you have your column adjustment. No telescoping on this steering wheel, it's just up and down, which all still works fine. And even though that the column is still here, you can definitely show where Chrysler's engineering was at this time. But it's what it is. But anyway, moving towards the bottom center of the dash, you have another knob right here for adjusting the passenger side mirror, which also works. Moving next to that, we have another cigarette ashtray with a tray still present and a cigarette lighter that is still present. And moving towards the right side of the dash, you have your glove box, which despite how loose it is, yes, it still holds on. Along each side of the glove box, you'll find 2 more air vents, which despite, again, not being very big, they blow lots of air. They're very well positioned for the front passenger, and all the adjustments still work on this car. And again, moving back to these very comfortable tufted seats, these seats are electrically adjustable. I have an 8-way adjustable front driver's seat and a 6-way power seat here with a manual backrest. And just like the blue Oldsmobile that I also did a video on, you can find that on Topher Parker Cars channel. You can pull this armrest up and then you have a 6-seater. Now it's not quite as well proportioned as the Oldsmobile was, considering how much more padding there is just for the front driver and passenger. But if you're in a pinch and you do need to take 5 more passengers around, there is a lap belt here in case you do need to take a front passenger. Now we're driving the Chrysler Fifth Avenue. Now, as we start pulling out, the first thing that you'll notice as I'm pulling out is the very pinky light power steering. That's probably one of my favorite parts about this car as I'm driving it, is just that considering this is not electric power steering, this is very well assisted. Now forgive me in advance for the lighting here. This is a very bad time to start driving this as the sun's now setting, and so there's probably a chance that the light will probably glare on the camera. So like I said, forgive me for that. But anyway, I'm now driving down the road at about, what the speedometer says, about 30 miles an hour, and so far not too much vibration, not too much wind noise. Well, I mean, there's a little bit of wind noise just because some seals worn out throughout the car. But as far as how the steering feels, how the engine is, it's very isolated, very smooth. It's very relaxed. And speaking of relaxed, that's pretty much how I'd summarize this engine. Because like this car, this engine came out when emissions was still kind of a new thought for American car companies. So they're still trying to figure out how to get power out of these engines. So despite this engine being a 5.2 liter V8, this is a 5.2 liter V8 that only makes, I want to say, 150 horsepower. Not only is that absolutely pathetic by today's standards, but so is the transmission. This is a 3-speed torque flight transmission. So it's not going to get that horsepower down in a particularly sporty manner. So in a moment, we'll be turning right here. Ooh, that's a nice 240. We'll be showing you just how slow this engine is. Yeah, wasn't quite full throttle there. It's enough to keep up with traffic, but you're not going to exactly beat anyone in a drag race with this car. Like I said, this is not a particularly sporty car. This car is tuned more for just cruising down the road, playing music, and just letting the car handle all the rest. Like I said, when I was accelerating back there, even though it wasn't very fast, the engine was very smooth, and the transmission, whenever it gets a chance to shift, because there's only 3 speeds, when it does go into gear, it's actually very smooth. You don't feel any jerking through the transmission as you're accelerating. And the engine itself is actually pretty quiet. A lot quieter than you think, considering this is a carbureted V8 engine from essentially the 1970s. And now we're about to get another chance to demonstrate the very high performance engine in this car. That was more of a full throttle back there, and honestly it wasn't that much faster than before, but like I said, it's not a sports car at all. This is the last car you think of when you're trying to beat someone out of light. And I did just have to brake briefly back there, And considering this car has no ABS, the brakes are very predictable and very strong in this car. And there were times when I've driven this car where I've had to unintentionally lock up because of local drivers not exactly knowing how to drive. But basically, when you do get a chance to brake hard in this car, it's not really as scary as you think it is, considering the lack of modern technology in this car. Speaking of this car not exactly being a sports car, that's also how I would talk about the handling. Yeah, not exactly a sports car. That mirror probably moved a good 2 feet up and down, just so I was trying to show you the slight demo of the handling on this car when I'm not even turning. I was just going back and forth. And even though these seats are very comfortable and not exactly designed for any kind of spirited driving, the seats are surprisingly more bolstered than you think. So when I was actually trying to rock the car a little bit back there earlier, I felt surprisingly well secure in the seats in this car. Again, the seats are very comfortable, as I've said many times before. Now, I'm gonna take this right turn a little bit spirited. Yeah, lots of body roll, but it's very controllable. And the steering is surprisingly predictable, considering that the steering is not built for any kind of spirited driving. And even though, like I said before, there's not that much horsepower in this car, it has enough torque to keep up with traffic just fine and maintain its speed without too much issue. As you start driving this kind of car, you get the impression that despite this car being downsized, you still get the impression that this feels like a very large car. Like I said, with the very small horsepower, the very soft suspension, and what feels like a very long hood up front, you feel like you're driving a 20-foot car, when realistically this isn't more than 15, 16 feet long. And because you still get the impression that you're driving a bigger car than it actually is, you drive around the road thinking you're better than anyone else. Looking in front of you, you have the large hood, and you get the transparent crystal hood ornament. You certainly feel like $1 million driving this car around. And despite all of what I said earlier about this car having very, very soft suspension, having a big car ride, it was honestly marketed as more of a mid-sized car. So I mean, especially considering that this is actually a mid-sized car, this car definitely drives more like a big car than any modern mid-sized car I've ever driven. Most mid-sized cars I drive today usually more feel like really small cars. They're very nimble, trying to go after that very small, lightweight car-like feel. This has none of that. This car went for the complete opposite. This car went for the biggest boat you could get, even though I wouldn't quite call it, land yacht. It's more of just a large boat, pretty much. Taking one last turn as we start heading back to our finishing point. Lots of body roll, but like I said, very predictable. And as we start turning into the final finishing point for this video, all I can say for now is that if you're really wanting a budget, old school American luxury car, try giving a good look at Chrysler Fifth Avenue as well, because I think it'd totally be worth your money if you're in the market for one of those kind of cars. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave any comments down in the comment section, and make sure to subscribe to Topher Parker Cars for more content like this. Thank you for watching.